So we all own space together. We all own space together. You don't own it, I don't own it. I can't claim it to be mine.
Right.
No country can put its flag and claim it for their country. So, for example, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin put the American flag, they weren't claiming the moon. They were just beating their chest and saying, "We beat you, Soviet Union."
The game I play is a very interesting one. It's imagination in a tight straitjacket.
Because by looking at the stars, we are literally looking back through time.
And as the world gets smaller and more connected, the narrative of freedom is rubbing off on people of different cultures and religions, however remote.
You can't get anywhere if you just copy what somebody told you. You have to be challenging things all the time, challenging everything, and thinking new thoughts and so on.
Welcome to Blabcoats. My name is Amit Siddiqui alongside Alex Ray, who's having a drink instead of paying attention to the intro.
It's a hot day in Western Sydney today, let me assure you. It's very hot.
So today on the podcast we have Professor Steven Freeland. Now, as Alex was saying before the podcast, there's a lot to go through in his intro, so we'll just keep it nice and succinct. So he's actually the Dean of School of Law and focuses on international criminal law, commercial law, public international law, and human rights law. Now, he's represented Australia at Australian government at many United Nations conferences and committees. But today, in particular, we wanted to have him on to talk about space law as well as his journeys. So, thank you for being on the podcast and welcome.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah. So, we always want to start the podcast focusing on the journey and to get an understanding of who our guest is and where you started and why you came down this path.
Okay, this path to where I am now, you mean?
Yeah, we'll get somebody interested in law. We've had lots of scientists on, but we haven't had any lawyers or anyone from the School of Law.
But law is intrinsically interesting. Parts of it are, at least. So, journey. When I finished my high school certificate a long time ago, 1,000 years ago, I did very well and had the marks that would have got me either into medicine or law, which are the two highest. As a good Jewish boy living in the eastern suburbs, that's all you did, either medicine or law. And for me, it was quite clear that I would not do medicine because I faint at the sight of blood, so to speak.
Me too.
Yeah.
I can't handle it.
Getting a blood test is horrible. I'm a bit flippant there, but so I did law, but not really thinking about it, but with a social conscience and law, but not only, but law certainly is a discipline, a way of thinking that also attunes you to social justice. And for me, I feel very strongly about that. I've felt very strongly about it my entire career in different ways, and I've had the opportunity to practice it as well. So I finished my HSC, did law, did well in law, got a job offer with what was then the largest law firm in the world, and said I'll just take a year off to try something else because I'd done a lot of acting. So I went and thought, I'm going to try to be a professional actor. And I went to London, managed by luck, really, to do quite a lot of acting at the West End, and did that for a year. Then when the law firm said, are you coming back? I said, look, I'd like another year. And they said, okay, we'll give you one more year. And then for the second half of that year, I went and fell in love and went and lived on a Greek island with a girl, and life was pretty good.
Wow.
But then I had to decide, because acting was quite a passion for me, had to decide what I would do. Would I come back to this amazing law firm which would send me all around the world, or would I pursue an acting career because there were other opportunities for me in London, which, you know, for an actor is a bit of a mecca. And literally did have that sliding door moment where you think, you know, one path, the other path, not that you ever regret. But in the end, I chose to go back to to start with the law firm. And the main reason I did that is for the year that I was in the West End in London, it was 1980, and the British economy was pretty poor. And in that year, 4 West End theatres closed. Because the economy was quite poor, and I just thought, I mean, this is the practical part, perhaps. Well, you know, it's very exciting being an impoverished actor, but if you can't even get a job, you know, and times are tough. So anyway, one never regrets. So I became then a commercial lawyer with this law firm. Was very fortunate to be able to travel quite a lot and be posted in various places around the world. Realised at about the age of 28, 29 that as much as I enjoyed what I was doing, which was a lot of, you know, quite significant legal transactions, that there was more to my personality perhaps than that. I had been approached and then finally joined a large multilateral, multinational investment bank, became an investment banker then for the next 15 or 16 years, which was also wonderful and allowed me to live again in many places of the world for quite lengthy periods of time. In fact, most of my professional career for the first 22 years was all overseas. I think out of that I spent 2 years in Australia. Then for personal reasons I made a deal with my then partner that I would retire at the grand old age of 40. Indeed,
Sounds great.
Yeah, because I never saw my family, and in fact did retire at 41 or 41 and a half, and this is in the late 1990s. I was born in 1957, and then thought, what the hell do I do now? So I actually then went back to university, half in Australia, half in the Netherlands, and did a Master of International Law. Then I came back to Australia, which was quite new for me, but again for family reasons, and thought, what the hell do I do now? And so I became an academic and joined Western Sydney University, and but I was, you know, quite a bit older with a bit more experience in one sense, and probably with an ego that was too big at that time, and thought, well, I don't want to, you know, I'm not 23, I'm 43 or 44, and I wanted to teach things that perhaps were different. And when I had done my master's, half of the time was in Utrecht in the Netherlands, and someone had taught a subject called space law there, which I did as part of my master's. It was quite an elderly gentleman, sadly I don't think he's alive anymore, who wasn't very good at teaching it, but, you know, who had thought about space law at this time. And so when I started teaching, I said, okay, I'll teach, but I want to set up this unit called Space Law, which I did do. And that was in 2002, 2003. And then I've been an academic since that time at Western Sydney, became a professor in 2010, I think, and have been dean for the last couple of years of the law school. So if that's a journey, I don't know. I've had 3 or 4 different careers. I still believe that there's another career or 2 out there for me. But I'm really fortunate because the things that are my interest, international law, so international criminal law, as you mentioned, I had the great privilege of working with judges of the International Criminal Court for 12 years. International law generally, I do a lot of work in various aspects. And of course, space law, which has really become incredibly important, dare I say sexy.
Yeah. It got us going.
Yeah, that's right. Over the past, certainly over a long period of time. And it's only really over the past 5 or 10 years that people, you know, not people who know about these things, but generally people are beginning to understand that space for us is ubiquitous. We utilize space 20, 30 times a day, and it's not just the GPS in our phone, although of course that's important, but in so many other ways space is important. And indeed, for every country, be they developed or less developed, a day without space would be a disaster. And because space is so political and so strategic and now so commercial and sadly so militarized and so imbued in the future of humanity, clearly you need rules, rules and standards. And so I've been involved very much in spreading the word about those rules, because a lot of law does exist at the international level. And then I've had the privilege of working with various governments, the Australian government, the New Zealand government, and a number of other governments around the world in drafting their national space laws. And it's just an area where so many things are relevant. So it's law, of course, it's policy, it's politics, it's environment, it's engineering, it's science, it's medicine, it's economics, it's humanity, all imbued in the way we utilize space. And so the legal aspects are fascinating, but the even more fascinating thing for me is seeing how that works in the real world. And because of my background, particularly as an investment banker, I'm a bit of a real world sort of guy. And it's just a fascinating area.
It definitely does sound fascinating. I have to say, you've lived quite a life.
Well, the only other thing, and the only other thing I said I was born in 1957, so I'm a natural to talk about space. Why? Well, I'm going to ask you.
Yeah.
You know what happened in 1957 that is relevant for space?
Cold War.
The Cold War was on.
Yeah.
Anyone in the audience here? Any of your listeners know? 1957, October the 4th.
Was it the first person in space?
Close, not quite. First person in space
dog in
was later.
space?
It was the first, close.
Oh.
It was the first human-made object in space called Sputnik. So we're, as you said, quite rightly, Alex, we're in the midst of the Cold War, right? Major tensions. The United States and the Soviet Union, at loggerheads in so many ways, both realized that rocket technology, which essentially was developed in a sense by the German war machine during the Second World War with their V1 and V2 rockets. But this would be another way that those two countries, the protagonists in the Cold War, could develop their strengths. So I'm a Sputnik baby. So when Sputnik went up in 1957, it's a really interesting thing, because we're in the midst of the Cold War. Also, we're only 4 or 5 years before the almost unthinkable happens with the Bay of Pigs in the early 60s, where we almost got so close to the unthinkable.
Yeah.
And so when Sputnik went up, the Soviet Union won that race and began a new race. And if you look at the New York Times on October the 5th, 1957, so the day after Sputnik, you'll see an article, front page, of course, Sputnik, Soviets launched Sputnik, or whatever it is. First paragraph or two is amazing scientific achievement that humans have actually managed to do this, to put something into Earth orbit. And the rest of the article is, oh my goodness, if they can do this, what else can they do? And this is based on rocket technology, this can launch weapons, and so it doubled and tripled and quadrupled the efforts of the Americans in developing their own technology. And so you had this incredible period of concentration by the two protagonists on space technology in a whole range of ways with military eyes. So all of the technologies that we all use every day, GPS and remote sensing and communication satellites, all were developed initially, the technology, with military eyes, but of course they also now have commercial uses as well.
Right.
So geopolitics played an incredible part in space and still does, because it's such a strategic area.
It's interesting you're starting there with the political side of it, because right now, when I think about space, I'm thinking about like Elon Musk and things like this, which is really a commercial side of it.
Sure.
So is there any kind of hard distinction between, I guess, the governmental kind of side of space law and a commercial side, or is it kind of one set of laws that covers everything?
Yeah, the international law covers the countries. That's the nature of international law, by and large, right? So we have a number of what we call treaties that were developed through the UN processes that bind countries, right? They don't bind corporations. And so space initially was envisaged, particularly by the Soviet Union, but not only, as being the realm of countries only. So any space activity would be done by the country. Over time, as I said, these technologies, people began to realize that commercial businesses could be born out of these technologies, as well as all of the other strategic stuff. So space over time became increasingly commercialized. That's not to say that countries are still not doing it, but it's become increasingly commercialized. And therefore, countries like Australia, like the United States, like any country really, has to and wants to, because of the strategic value, because of the economics, because, let's face it, the dangers to safety and whatever, they want to be able to control, not necessarily in a negative way, but control those within their own jurisdiction who want to engage in space. And so increasingly you have these international rules binding the countries, but to then bind the Elon Musks of the world, the United States has to pass national space law. So incorporating to a certain degree those things that exist at the international level, international law. So many countries now, as well as being parties and bound to the international system, have national space law which is directed towards corporates or individuals who want to engage in space. And so the country then can regulate, just like any other behaviour, can regulate that behaviour. So you've got, in a sense, two levels.
Kind of.
But they both work and they both operate. So space is now highly commercialised. The world space economy last year was something like about in Australian dollars, probably 450 billion Australian dollars worldwide, and is growing at 10% per year. Now, the world economy, which is obviously much, 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 much bigger, is growing at 2 to 3% a year. So this space economy is growing at 3 or 4 times the rest of the world economy. And there are so many opportunities, so many challenges for law, for regulation, because, as Alex and Hamid, you said at the beginning, the technology is racing ahead. And like anything, law cannot and should not ever try to keep up. It can't keep up because the technology is changing so much. Yet, as regulators, as trying to get standards that make sense, we still have to try to find ways to regulate stuff that is happening and moving so quickly. It's a real challenge.
And that's where you were mentioning that it involves engineering and all these other fields where you have to liaise with them and determine what sort of technologies could be in the horizon so they could...
Absolutely. You've hit the nail on the coffin. The way disciplines work and professions work is people traditionally operate in relative silos, right? And in this area, as a space lawyer, if that's what you call me, as a space lawyer, I really have to understand physics of how orbits work. I have to understand the engineering capabilities. I have to understand so many things that I don't truly understand, but at least I have a feel for it. And Hamid, exactly as you said, we've got to regulate for the unknown is incredibly difficult, right? Whenever I work for governments are very demanding clients, and they say, help us, draft our national law, which I've done for a number of countries, including Australia. Draft our national law, but make it future-proof, i.e. draft it in a way that will cover everything that happens in the future.
So you have to predict where the science is going before the scientists do.
Exactly. But that is, of course you allow for flexibility, but it's impossible. And the answer is, even though we'll never get it perfect because we'll always be lagging behind that next change, but the answer, exactly as you said, is you need to get the engineers and the scientists and the politicians and the economists and the lawyers and the regulators and many others all in the same room to talk about these things. And frankly, that the way the world works, that doesn't really happen that much. And so I'm on a bit of a crusade to make sure that we understand that. And of course we do. It'll make me better at what I do. It'll make the engineers better in what they do if they understand that there are some problems here. And there's problems, for example, with space junk. And so you design and regulation about space junk. So you design your satellite in a way that mitigates the possibility that it'll break up or something like that. You know, but there's a whole range of issues. So yes, it's multifaceted. It's a fantastic area, space, and there are so many opportunities in so many different areas.
Just, you know, we had Miao Ludo, the transhumanist guy, and he was saying that as technology progresses, it's almost exponential, and it becomes harder and harder to predict what's in the future. So is it also, so I guess the question I have, what is the lifetime of predictions when it comes to space law, and do you think that's going to reduce over time, where you get to a point where you can't even predict what's going to happen tomorrow because technology is advancing so fast?
Incredible question. I wish I had an incredible answer to match it. So how do I answer that? Think of your mobile phones. Right? Think of 5 years ago. You know, it would have been unimaginable for you, and you're of that generation which is very tech savvy, right?
Alex, not so much.
Every opportunity.
Alex would lead me for dead, though. but you are of that mindset where you understand, you know, and yet you would never have thought what you can do with your smartphone now, right? Sure. And in 5 years from now, we'll just be shaking our head, saying, you know, we would never have thought. So it's very difficult to predict the future in terms of the way technology works. The same with space. You know, that in more recent times, there's this development of small satellite technology. Now, satellites come in all shapes and sizes. They're custom built. They're in a whole range of different orbits depending on what they do. But typically in the past, satellites have been quite big, right? You know, from the size of a Volkswagen to the size of a school bus. But so many variations. There is, you know, there's no standard because they're all custom built, because they cost a lot of money. Small satellite technology will not replace those, but will give us more capability, but also give you as individuals and small corporations and startups the ability to access space, whereas in the past it would have been impossible because of the cost and a whole range of other issues. And I say to people that I liken the small satellite technology to the mobile phones of space. We just don't know, Hamid, where it's going to take us. We just don't know. We can, of course, make predictions, but who knows where we go? And typically in any area, we just have to react. Hopefully we don't have to wait until the disaster happens, like space tourism and there's a major disaster, right, to then work out. But put yourself in the mind of a regulator, right? I mean, I'm not a government person, but I've worked for government, so I sympathise with the people who actually have to write laws, right? And I say to you guys, okay, have a great weekend, draft a law about the safety standards for space tourism. And you go, wow, you know, and you look around and you try to do your research, you know, and you do your best. And then that's published, you know, okay, from now on these are the official minimum standards that anyone who's engaged in space tourism has to, you know, in terms of design, in terms of safety, in terms of, you know, you get all the features, And then someone follows that and goes up, and heaven forbid, but it will happen, there'll be a disaster. It'll blow up, 20 people will be killed, right? And they will say, well, we just followed the regulatory framework, right? And it's almost as if we have to start again. It's impossibly difficult, yet in a sense we're being asked to do that. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but you can just see that you really have to have some flexibility. It's really difficult to do this, but we've got to do it because you can't let, you have to encourage responsible behaviour. And if you say, well, go ahead and do this, we'll wait for the first disaster and then we'll know at least to that extent what went wrong and we'll start regulating from there, then who knows what sort of behaviour goes on in the meantime. Plus we've always got this idea of creating additional space junk as well, which is a major issue. So it's really a balance. It's a balance between not being too prescriptive and perhaps getting it wrong, to making sure that you're encouraging the right behaviour, and yet also encouraging, depending on the risk profile of the country, entrepreneurship and creativity and commercial opportunities and all of that, but yet still being a good international citizen. You know, it's a really interesting, complex area. So there is no time frame that is real. If someone says to you, hey, I can read into the future and this is what we're going to do, they might have a good idea, but they certainly may be wrong as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we've talked about a few, like lots of different things, pollution in space, space junk, space tourism you mentioned as well. I also think like who owns space, like mining resources and things like that, like who owns that stuff up there? I guess we could talk all day about the types of regulations that currently exist, but probably what's more interesting is, are there any like gaps? Is there anything missing that we really haven't thought about yet, or that we don't have regulations or law to address?
Good question again. So I mentioned there is this international framework of treaties. They were developed in the 60s and 70s, and they set some really fundamental principles about how we view space. And the reason we haven't had any more treaties since the late 70s is again political. It's because the legal characterization of space is that it's what we deem to be, although this is an unlegal term really, a global commons. So we all own space together. We all own space together. You don't own it, I don't own it, I can't claim it to be mine. Right. No country can put its flag and claim it for their country. So, for example, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin put the American flag, they weren't claiming the moon, they were just beating their chest and saying, we beat you, Soviet Union, right? So this, I always liken space to a piece of apple pie. Imagine an apple pie sitting there and it belongs to all of us. And there am I, and I'm eating away at it. Oh, this is a great apple pie. And you're saying, hey, stop eating. It belongs to me as much as it belongs to you. And if you keep eating, there'll be nothing left for me. And I say to you, hey, this belongs to all of us. Come on down. Come. Knowing full well you don't have the capability, right? Because it's a have and have not capability in space. And so there's so many political things, but in the 70s, former colonies became countries. Right? There was a process of decolonization. So for your listeners, in 1945, when the United Nations Charter came into being, there were 51 countries in the world. Today there are, let's say, 200 countries, there or thereabouts. The vast majority of those new countries were former colonies. So if you look at the continent of Africa, for example, 53 countries, every one of them, apart from one, Ethiopia, were former colonies. So the thing about being a colony is when you were a colony, the colonial masters, be they the British or the French or the Belgians or the Germans or whatever, the Americans, any colonial master raped and pillaged the country. They would take the resources and really, you know, some did better than others, not do a very good job looking after the people, the infrastructure, rape the resources. And so now, go back to space. This apple pie, these new countries have come on board. They exist. And you say to them, here's a massive, let's call it resource, which is outer space, which can give rise to so many amazing things. Belongs to all of us, but only 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 of you are actually eating that apple pie. And you think as a small country, it's all happening again. We're being raped and pillaged of our resources. And so that sort of debate, obviously a lot more sophisticated than that, came up in the late 70s when we had a treaty that dealt with exactly the issue you raised, Alex, the mining of resources on space. And the developing countries, many existed then, this process was a UN process where it was one state, one vote. So the number of developing countries, and they were bigger, right? And so they managed to put into this treaty ideas about, yes, go ahead and mine, you know, all of those 2 or 3 or 4 countries that can do it. But if you do, you know, you've got to obviously meet the various standards of environmental protection and safety, but also you need to share benefits with us in some way. That debate was going on in the moon, and exactly the same time it was also going on with the deep seabed. There's another whole regime about the deep seabed, mining the deep seabed. And in both of those regimes, the developing countries essentially forced by their weight of numbers, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, into the respective regimes, this idea of sharing benefits. So the industrialized countries said, well, why would we? You know, why should we?
You're right.
And so after that, this last treaty in space, the Moon Agreement, was not very well subscribed to, although Australia is a party to it. And we haven't had any other treaties. We've had a number of less binding instruments, guidelines and things about specific things. But in answer to your question, because that's really contextual to answer the question, which is we can do so many things in space now.
Yeah.
And these fundamental principles, they're fantastic, right? About how we view space, how we act in space. We've got to, take care of others' interests. We've got to have peaceful purposes. But they don't deal with the specifics of tourism because it was never envisaged when they had these treaties in the 60s and 70s. We don't deal with the specifics of suborbital flights. We don't have the specifics of a whole range of things that we can actually do. So, are there gaps? The fundamental principles that we have serve us brilliantly. Space actually has worked from a regulatory viewpoint. Nothing's perfect, but it's actually worked. We haven't had a war there.
Yeah.
And people have developed these amazing technologies, and they continue to do that. So, to a certain degree, it works quite well. That said, we're doing a whole bunch of things where we don't have specific regimes in place. So we know the generalities. We know that if you're going to do a space tourism activity, there are fundamental principles you've got to follow which will guide. But clearly it would be great if we had more specific rules about that. And the same debate is going on about the mining of resources now. As I said, that debate is not a new debate. That was already the late 70s. And it just, there was excitement about mining the moon after the analysis of the samples by the Apollo missions. It just didn't go ahead for political and a whole range of other reasons. Now it's exciting again, although I'm not convinced that it will happen anytime soon in commercial quantities. There's a whole lot of debate going on about what the rules are. And clearly my view on this and other things is the fundamental principles serve us well, but we need specifics. But in the end, these things, like the exploitation of resources, despite the fact that one or two countries are now passing national laws to say, go ahead to their own people, they're still bound by these international principles. And my own feeling, although people have accused me of being a bit optimistic on this, is when it really gets to the point when the industry has done all this incredible work and they have shown that this is real. It's real in the fact that we can really, and I'm not sure when that will be. We can really start commercially exploiting asteroids and things like that. Then I think that the major space players, countries, and in fact the community will get together and work out the rules because some of these things are too big and too important and too, frankly, political, let alone commercial, for one or two countries, let alone one or two companies, to try to do this stuff. This is very big, and so, we're pretty good at adapting. We're exploiting space already. There's this resource in space called the Geostationary Orbit. I don't know whether you've heard of it. Some of your listeners would. And it's a particular orbit which has particular characteristics that make it very, very attractive to put your satellite.
So it's an orbit that matches up with the rotation
exactly.
of the Earth.
So by and large, there are many, many orbits that are used for many, many different things. This particular orbit, which is 36,000 kilometers away, so it's a long way away, is good for communications because exactly as you say, it's obviously subject to gravity, so it's not quite as simple as this. You've got to do a lot of station keeping. But essentially, if you put your satellite there over Australia, it will follow the rotation of the Earth and be constant over Australia so that your Optus or NBN person can go on your roof, point your satellite dish, and it's forever pointing to the satellite. That's the theory. Obviously, it's much, much more complicated, but it's an incredible resource. And again, in the early days, it was just one or two countries that were eating that apple pie. And ultimately, lots of lobbying and politics and negotiations, we now have a regime that manages that really well through a UN body called the International Telecommunication Union. So when the cliche that necessity is the mother of invention, and I don't mean invention in terms of inventing new activities, but inventing new ways of regulating activity. Yeah. I'm a believer that we will do it because we have to do it, and in the end, it's in everybody's interests. And that's also because space is also lots of people talking about space as a war-fighting domain, and it's extraordinarily irresponsible rhetoric. I mean, sure, it's used for military purposes all the time. We understand that, but it's used for many other things as well. But in the end, an interesting comparison for your listeners, I always compare space to climate change. So if you think about climate change, major challenge for the world, right? Who are the countries that are going to suffer the most, at least in the beginning of climate change?
It's the developing countries.
The small ones. Sure. The small developing countries.
One's contributing probably the least to it.
Exactly. In space, the ones that are going to suffer the most at the beginning, if irresponsible behaviour, people start blowing up satellites or there's too much junk or whatever, are the big, large countries, because they're the players in space. They're the ones that are so dependent on space. The United States, if you demobilised a couple of strategic GPS satellites, their entire sewage system would collapse. Their entire railroad network would collapse. Their entire traffic network would collapse, let alone all sorts of other things. So the major countries are so heavily dependent on space that if things go completely belly up in space, they're the ones that will suffer the most in the beginning. Everybody suffers, of course, because, and so for me that's a major difference, and for me that's a major point where, despite all the rhetoric, despite the fierce competition, the major countries have to realise, and no doubt some people do, some people need to be told, that in the end, if you are irresponsible, it's self-defeating.
Yeah. So that's what makes you an optimist. I like that. We've kind of hit 30 minminutes.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much for being.
I hope I get the MBN on soon, though. I'm still waiting.
Do you take on research students?
I do. I'm very happy. I'm looking. We have great space capability at this university. I mean, we have law, of course, law and policy, which is me, but we have neuromorphic medicine and really amazing stuff. We've got radio astronomy. We've got a really strong startup community support, because many of these small satellite companies are startup companies. We're going to build, I think, at this university even more capability, and I hope to be an integral part of it. I'm constantly looking for it. Of course, we've got great engineering faculty. Aerospace engineering is something that I hope we're going to bring in here as well. So yes, we would like more students.
That's awesome. There you go. If you're interested in working with Professor Steven Freeland, definitely hit him up, and you can find his details on Google. If you can't, you probably shouldn't be a research student.
Thanks for your time.
You again.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Hey, did you like this episode? If so, why don't you head over to iTunes and rate and review us, like our Facebook and Twitter pages, as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. What will help us the most is if you share this episode with a friend and spread the good news.